She was 17 years old, and she had nowhere in the world left to sleep. Her uncle, Silas Whitfield, had put her out of the only home she'd ever known on a gray Tuesday morning, telling her plainly that a grown niece was a burden he no longer intended to carry. In her pocket, she carried $4.75. Every coin of it earned mending shirts by lamplight, and with it, she meant to buy herself some kind of shelter before the Colorado nights turned cold. What she found, sitting forgotten on a rusted siding behind the Amber Creek Depot, was a retired railroad passenger car nobody wanted, offered to her for $3 by a yardmaster eager to be rid of it. Folks who watched her hand over her savings for a car with broken windows and a floor thick with dust called it a foolish, desperate trade, the kind of purchase only a girl with nothing left to lose would make. They did not know that beneath one splintered seat, sealed away for 15 years, waited something that would not only rewrite her own future, but restore a wound this whole town had been quietly carrying since before she was born. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, the way that old car sat forgotten on its siding, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Clara Whitfield had been born in the spring of 1871 in a two-room house at the edge of Amber Creek, Colorado Territory, a town stitched together by cattle money and the promise of the railroad that had finally reached it 2 years before her birth. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, was the town's blacksmith, a broad, quiet man with hands scarred pale from forge work and a habit of humming old hymns under his breath while he shaped iron. Her mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when Clara was only 4, leaving behind little more than a cedar sewing box and a Bible with names written in the front in careful, looping script. Thomas raised his daughter alone after that, and though the town sometimes clucked its tongue at a man raising a girl without a wife's hand to guide her, Thomas simply set Clara on an overturned bucket beside his anvil and taught her what he knew, which was patience and precision and the particular dignity of making something useful out of raw and stubborn material. It was not blacksmithing that took root in Clara, though she could work a bellows by the time she was 8 and had calluses to prove it. It was needlework, taught to her in scraps of evening time by an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Agatha Pruitt, who had once sewn dresses for ranch wives across 3 counties before her eyesight began to fail. Mrs. Pruitt saw in Clara a steadiness of hand and an eye for detail that most children lacked, and she poured into the girl everything she knew, not just of stitches and seams, but of a philosophy she repeated so often that Clara could recite it in her sleep. "Nothing is truly ruined, child," the old woman would say, turning a torn and stained garment over in her spotted hands. "There is always a way to turn the damage into the design, if you are patient enough to look for it." Clara took this lesson far beyond the sewing basket. She began to notice how the discarded became valuable in the right hands, how a cracked plate could be mended with wire and become more beautiful for its scars, how a bent nail could be straightened and used again, how nothing her father tossed aside, as ruined at the forge, was ever quite as useless as it first appeared. It became, without her quite realizing it, the guiding philosophy of her whole young life, a quiet conviction that value was often hidden rather than absent, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. Her father encouraged this in her, delighted by the seriousness with which she approached her small trade. By the time Clara was 14, she was taking in mending work of her own, charging a few cents a garment, saving what she earned in a tin box beneath her bed, rather than spending it on ribbons or sweets, the way other girls her age might have. Thomas would sometimes tease her gently about her thriftiness, but there was pride under the teasing, and in the evenings, after supper, father and daughter would sit together on the porch of their small house, while he told her stories about the town's early days, about the railroad crews, who had come through blasting rock and laying track, about the promises the rail company had made to Amber Creek, and, in Clara's later years, the promises that seemed to have quietly gone unkept. He never explained exactly what he meant by that, only that there had once been trouble at the depot, trouble that had cost a man his good name, and that he did not believe the truth of it had ever come fully to light. Clara filed the comment away the way she filed away every scrap of fabric too small to use immediately, sensing without knowing why, that it might matter to her someday. Life in Amber Creek settled into its rhythms around the Whitfield household, the ring of Thomas's hammer against iron, marking the hours as surely as the church bell. And Clara grew from a girl who sat on a bucket by the forge into a young woman known around town for her fine, careful stitching and her quiet, watchful manner. She was not loud or easily noticed in a crowd, but those who knew her found in her a steadiness that made them trust her, whether they were bringing her a torn coat to mend or simply looking for someone who would listen without judgment. It was this reputation, more than anything, that would matter later, though on the ordinary days of her girlhood, she gave it no particular thought. She believed, as most young people do, that the shape of her life had already been more or less decided, that she would go on mending and helping her father, and eventually, perhaps, marry and raise a family of her own, in the only town she had ever known. She could not have imagined, sitting on that porch listening to her father's half-finished stories, how completely and how quickly that quiet, settled life was about to come apart. The fever that took Thomas Whitfield arrived in the autumn of 1888, the same illness that had claimed Ruth 13 years before, moving through Amber Creek on the heels of a wet, unseasonable season, and settling into the lungs of half a dozen townsfolk before it found its way to the smithy. Clara nursed her father for 11 days, sitting beside his bed with cool cloths and broth she could barely get him to swallow, praying in the desperate, bargaining way of someone who has already lost one parent and cannot conceive of losing the other. He died on a Thursday morning in October, with Clara's hand in his, and the last thing he managed to tell her, in a voice reduced to little more than breath, was that she should trust her own hands, that they would never fail her the way the world sometimes might. She did not fully understand what he meant by it then. She would come to understand it very well in the months that followed. Because Thomas Whitfield had died without a will and without a wife, and because the laws and customs of the territory in that era gave little standing to an unmarried 17-year-old girl, the small house and the smithy passed by right of inheritance to Thomas's older brother, Silas Whitfield, a man who had left Amber Creek as a young man to try his fortune in the mining camps further west, and had returned only twice in Clara's memory, both times with an air of a man counting up what he was owed. Silas arrived within a fortnight of the funeral, dressed better than a grieving brother ought to be, and made it clear within his first evening in the house that he had no intention of raising a niece he barely knew, and even less intention of letting sentiment interfere with selling off the smithy and the house to the highest bidder. He was not cruel in any dramatic sense, not the sort of villain who raised his voice or his hand. He was worse, in a way, because his coldness was so businesslike, so untroubled, as if Clara herself were simply another asset to be liquidated along with the anvil and the tools. He gave her 2 weeks to find other arrangements, informed her that he would not be extending her room or board past that, and by the time the leaves had gone from the cottonwoods along the creek, Clara Whitfield found herself standing outside the only house she had ever lived in, with a single carpetbag of belongings and a tin box containing $4.75, watching her uncle nail a for-sale notice to the door of her father's smithy. She spent the first several nights sleeping wherever kindness or luck allowed, in the hayloft of a family who had once brought her mending, on a church pew when the reverend looked the other way, and once, memorably and miserably, huddled beneath the eave of the general store during a cold rain that left her shivering until dawn. She did not beg, and she did not complain, because both instincts had been trained out of her by a father who believed dignity was worth more than comfort, but she understood, with the plain clarity of someone facing facts squarely, that she could not go on this way for long. Winter was coming to the high country, and $4.75 was not a sum that would carry her far, whatever she did with it. She began walking the length of the town each day, looking not for charity, but for some kind of foothold, some cheap and overlooked corner of Amber Creek she might claim as her own, however humble. And it was on the 4th day of this searching that she found herself standing at the edge of the depot yard, looking at the railroad car that would change everything. It sat alone on a spur of disused track behind the main depot, a once handsome passenger car with faded green paint, peeling from its sides, and half its windows, either broken or boarded, clearly abandoned when the rail line had rerouted its main service through a new junction 3 years before, and left this older rolling stock to rot on a siding nobody bothered to maintain. Clara had passed it a dozen times without much notice, but that afternoon, with nowhere else to turn, she found herself studying it the way she might study a torn and stained garment brought to her for mending. Looking past its ruin to what it might still become, she found the yardmaster, a heavy-set, tired man named Otis Renner, dozing in the depot office, and asked him plainly what the railroad intended to do with the car. He laughed, not unkindly, and told her the company considered it scrap, worth more broken down for parts than left standing, and that if she had $3 and a way to keep it from becoming an eyesore, they'd sell it to her gladly and save themselves the trouble of hauling it off. Word had already begun to travel through town by the time she counted out the coins into his palm, and by evening, more than one person had shaken their head at the sight of Thomas Whitfield's daughter, homeless and desperate, spending nearly all she had on a rusting railroad car nobody else would want. It seemed, to anyone watching, like the last foolish act of a girl with nothing left to lose. It seemed that way to Clara herself, some nights, as she swept out 15 years of dust and pigeon droppings by lantern light, and told herself that at least it kept the wind off her. The first days inside the car were spent in the unglamorous labor of making a ruin livable, and Clara approached the task the way she approached everything, methodically, without complaint, treating the work itself as a kind of comfort. She patched the broken windows with oilcloth, donated by a sympathetic shopkeeper, swept the narrow aisle clean, and began the slow process of examining each of the car's remaining seats, hoping to salvage the cushions for bedding, since she owned no proper mattress, and the nights were growing sharper by the week. It was in prying loose the cushion of the third seat from the rear, a seat whose upholstery had come away from its frame with unusual ease, that her fingers found something the wood beneath should not have had, a seam too straight and too deliberate to be accidental damage, a section of the seat's base that had clearly been cut and refitted by careful hands, rather than worn by time. She worked at it for the better part of an hour by lantern light, prying gently with a flathead tool, borrowed from her father's old kit, the one possession from the smithy Silas had not thought worth confiscating, until the false bottom of the seat lifted away to reveal a shallow compartment built into the frame itself, the kind of hiding place a craftsman constructs when he wants something kept safe from casual eyes, but does not want it destroyed in the finding. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with initials she did not recognize, E.B., and beneath the ledger, a bundle of letters tied with cord, and beneath those, wrapped separately and heavier than either, a small iron strongbox, no larger than a bread loaf, its lock rusted shut. Clara sat back on her heels in the lantern's wavering light and stared at what she had found, understanding immediately, with the instinct of a girl raised to notice what others discarded, that this was no accident of storage. Someone had hidden these things here on purpose, and had never come back for them. It took her 3 careful evenings to work the ledger's fragile pages apart, without tearing them, and what she read there, slowly and by lamplight, unspooled a story 15 years old, that reached back further into Amber Creek's history than she had ever imagined her own life could touch. The ledger belonged, according to its opening pages, to a man named Eli Bannerman, who had served as the paymaster for the Colorado and Western Rail Company's Amber Creek division in the years the line first reached the town, a position of considerable trust that placed him in charge of the wages owed to hundreds of laborers, many of them men who had risked and sometimes lost their health blasting the mountain passes the railroad demanded. The ledger recorded payroll disbursements in Bannerman's own careful hand, month after month, until abruptly, in an entry dated the autumn of 1873, the tone of the writing changed, growing tighter and more urgent, describing discrepancies Bannerman had discovered between the wages the company reported paying out and the wages laborers actually received, a gap that, by his own careful reckoning, amounted to a considerable sum skimmed off the top by someone with the authority to falsify the company's books. The letters, when Clara untied them, filled in what the ledger only implied. They were written by Bannerman to his wife, though whether they had ever been sent or were drafts he never mailed, Clara could not say. And in them, he described his growing certainty that the man responsible for the theft was none other than the division superintendent himself, a man named Horace Kane, who oversaw the Amber Creek line and who Bannerman believed had been quietly pocketing a portion of the laborers' wages for years, covering the shortfall by delaying payments and blaming the company's distant bookkeepers in Denver for the confusion. Bannerman wrote that he intended to bring his evidence, the very ledger Clara now held, before the company's regional office, but that he feared what Kane might do if he learned of it first, given the power Kane held over every job and every family in the division. The final letter in the bundle, dated only days before the ledger's entries stopped altogether, described Bannerman's plan to hide his evidence somewhere safe, along with a portion of payroll money he had managed to quietly set aside and protect before Kane could seize or destroy it. Money meant, he wrote, for the widows and injured men the company itself refused to compensate. He had chosen, he explained, a hiding place no one would think to search, a passenger car sitting temporarily on a siding for repairs, trusting he would return for it once the truth was safely told. He never did. The final page of the ledger, in a different, hastier hand that was not Bannerman's own, recorded only that Eli Bannerman had left Amber Creek suddenly, one winter night, in 1873, and was never seen in the territory again, and that Superintendent Horace Kane had subsequently informed the town that Bannerman himself had been the one skimming the payroll and had fled to avoid arrest, taking the missing money with him. Clara sat with this discovery for a long while before she understood its full weight, turning back through the ledger's careful figures and Bannerman's increasingly worried letters until the shape of it became unmistakable to her. A man had uncovered a wrong being, done to the very laborers who had built this town's railroad, had tried to protect the evidence and a portion of the stolen wages meant for the community's most vulnerable, and had then vanished from history entirely, his name quietly rewritten by the very man he had accused, so thoroughly that 15 years later, not even Clara, born and raised in Amber Creek, had ever heard the name Eli Bannerman spoken aloud. She thought of her father's half-finished stories about trouble at the depot, and a man who had lost his good name, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air, that Thomas Whitfield had known this history too, or some fragment of it, and had never lived to tell her the rest. The iron strongbox, when she finally managed to force its rusted lock with a tool from the smithy kit, revealed a modest sum of gold coin, carefully wrapped, along with a single folded document that made Clara's breath catch, a deed to a small parcel of land at the edge of town, purchased in Bannerman's name, apparently intended, according to a scrawled note pinned to it, as the future site of a school and a relief fund for injured rail workers and their families, a promise the town itself had never received. Clara returned to the ledger many times in the weeks that followed, drawn back to Bannerman's careful figures the way one returns to a wound to see if it has healed, and each reading revealed some new detail she had missed before. She found, tucked near the back of the ledger between two accounting pages, a small pressed flower gone brittle and colorless with age, and beside it, in Bannerman's hand, a note that read simply, "For my daughter, when she is old enough to understand why her father could not come home." Clara sat with that single line for a long while, understanding for the first time that Eli Bannerman had not vanished into some anonymous, unmourned obscurity, but had left behind a family of his own, a wife, and at least one child, who had likely spent 15 years believing their husband and father to be either a thief or a coward, never knowing the truth of what he had sacrificed. It settled something in her, that discovery, hardening her quiet resolve into something closer to duty. She was no longer simply defending her own claim to a rail car and the gold it had hidden. She was carrying, whether she had asked for the weight or not, the unfinished business of a man who could no longer carry it himself, and a family somewhere who deserved, at the very least, to know his name had been cleared. Amber Creek in 1889 had not forgotten the Kane name, though it had long since stopped associating it with anything but respectability. for Horace Kane's son, Augustus Kane, had grown to become one of the town's most prominent men, owner of the Amber Creek Mercantile Bank, a stern and well-tailored figure who sat on the town council and whose approval or disapproval could make or break a smaller business with a word in the right ear. Clara did not go to Augustus Kane first with what she had found, understanding instinctively that a man built on his father's reputation might not welcome the unraveling of it, but she made the mistake, born of an honest heart rather than poor judgment, of mentioning her discovery to Otis Renner, the yardmaster, in the course of asking whether the railroad company might still have old employment records from the 1870s. Word traveled quickly in a town the size of Amber Creek, and within a week, Augustus Kane himself came to call at the railroad car Clara, now called home, polite and smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes, offering to buy the car back from her for 10 times what she had paid, no questions asked, framing it as an act of generosity toward a poor orphaned girl who surely did not want to live in a rusting rail car when she could have real money in her pocket. Clara, who had learned patience and precision at her father's forge, and the art of seeing worth where others saw ruin at Mrs. Pruitt's sewing table, understood exactly what was being offered and exactly what it was meant to bury, and she declined the offer as politely as it had been made, saying only that she had grown fond of her small home and did not wish to sell. The smile left Augustus Kane's face at that, and what followed in the weeks after was not violence, for men like Kane rarely dirtied their own hands, but a slow, deliberate campaign to make Clara's position in Amber Creek untenable. Rumors began circulating that the girl in the railroad car had stolen goods from the depot, that she was disturbed in her mind from the shock of her father's death, that decent families ought to steer their daughters clear of her company. The bank, quite suddenly, called in a small debt Mrs. Pruitt had carried for years without trouble, forcing the old woman to scramble for funds and making it plain to Clara, without a word being said directly, whose kindness toward her might cost others dearly. Even Otis Renner, who had sold her the car in good conscience, found himself abruptly informed that his position with the railroad was under review, and grew noticeably cooler toward Clara whenever she came around the depot afterward, torn between decency and the fear of losing his livelihood. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that rarely make it into any official record, but that wear at a person all the same. The proprietor of the general store, a man who had once extended Clara credit without a second thought, began asking her to pay in full and in advance, murmuring apologies about business being business. Children who had once waved to her from the schoolyard fence were told by careful parents to keep their distance from the strange girl living in the old rail car, and Clara, walking the length of town on her daily errands, grew accustomed to conversations that stopped abruptly when she drew near, and resumed, in lowered voices, once she had passed. She bore it the way she had learned to bear grief, without complaint, and without the satisfaction of anyone seeing how deeply it cut, though some nights, alone in the lantern light, with only Bannerman's careful handwriting for company, she allowed herself to wonder whether the truth was worth the isolation it seemed determined to cost her. It would have been easy, in the face of this, for Clara to fold, to sell the ledger and the letters and the gold quietly back to Kane for whatever price he offered, and disappear from Amber Creek to start over somewhere. The Kane name held no power, and there were nights, huddled in her rail car against a mounting winter, when she considered exactly that. But she thought of Eli Bannerman's careful, worried handwriting, of a man who had risked everything he had to protect wages owed to injured laborers and grieving widows, and she thought of her father's hands at the forge, patient and unyielding, straightening what the world had bent. She decided, sitting alone by lantern light, with the ledger open on her lap, that she would not be the second person Augustus Kane's family managed to erase from Amber Creek's memory. She began, quietly and carefully, to build a case the way her father might have shaped a piece of iron, one deliberate strike at a time. She sought out Amos Whitcomb, a retired track foreman, well into his 70s, who had worked the Amber Creek line since its earliest days, and who, when Clara finally worked up the courage to show him the ledger, wept openly at the sight of Eli Bannerman's handwriting, confirming everything the letters implied, and adding details of his own, remembering how laborers had gone unpaid for weeks at a time under Horace Kane's supervision, and how Bannerman had quietly made up shortfalls out of his own pocket before he disappeared. Amos knew others too, old rail hands and their widows scattered around the county, men and women who still remembered wages that never quite added up, and a paymaster who had vanished under a cloud no one had ever quite believed suited the gentle, careful man they'd known. Clara spent the better part of 2 months gathering these testimonies, writing them down in her own careful hand, the way she once recorded measurements for a garment, cross-referencing every account against the figures in Bannerman's ledger, until the pattern of Horace Kane's old theft stood out as plainly as a seam mismatched in cloth. She wrote, too, to the regional office of the Colorado and Western Rail Company in Denver, enclosing copies of the ledger's key pages and a summary of what she had found, uncertain whether any reply would come at all from a company that had shown little interest in Amber Creek's laborers 15 years before. While she waited, Augustus Kane's pressure on her only intensified. Culminating in a town council meeting, Clara was summoned to attend, ostensibly to answer questions about squatting on railroad property, though everyone in the room understood the meeting's true purpose was to publicly humiliate her into surrendering or leaving town. Kane stood before the assembled council and townsfolk that evening and painted Clara as an unstable young woman making wild accusations against an old and respected family, his voice smooth and confident in the way of a man who had never once in his life expected to be contradicted. It was Amos Whitcomb who rose first from the gathered crowd, his old voice cracking but steady, to say that he had worked this line since before Augustus Kane was born, and that he remembered Eli Bannerman as an honest man wronged, and that he would swear to it before God or anyone else who asked. He was followed by 2 other old rail hands, and then, to the visible shock of the room, by Mrs. Pruitt herself, who stood, despite her failing eyes, to say that she had known Clara Whitfield since the girl was in short dresses and had never once known her to speak an untrue word, and that she trusted the girl's account of that ledger more than she trusted a banker's smile. Clara herself spoke last, laying out the ledger's entries and the corroborating testimonies with the same calm, unhurried precision she brought to every careful stitch, refusing to raise her voice, even as Augustus Kane's composure began, for the first time anyone in that room had ever witnessed, visibly to crack. The meeting ended without resolution that night, but something in Amber Creek had shifted, the way frost shifts a fence post over a long winter, invisibly at first, and then all at once undeniable. The company's reply, when it finally arrived from Denver some weeks later, came in the form of a regional auditor sent to review the old accounts. A dry, thorough man named Percival Voss, who spent a full week going through what remained of the division's 15-year-old records, alongside the evidence Clara had assembled, and who concluded, in a formal letter delivered to the town council, that the historical records substantially supported the claim that payroll funds had been misappropriated under Superintendent Horace Kane's supervision, and that Eli Bannerman's dismissal and disappearance had occurred under circumstances the company now regarded as deeply unjust. It was not, in the end, a dramatic unmasking, so much as a slow, official confirmation of what the town had already begun to believe in its heart, but its effect on Augustus Kane was immediate and severe. Depositors, uneasy at the revelation that the family fortune underpinning the Amber Creek Mercantile Bank had been built in part on stolen wages, began quietly withdrawing their accounts, and the town council, no longer inclined to defer to a man whose family's respectability had proven so thin a coat of paint, declined to renew several of the favorable contracts that had long enriched Kane's businesses. He did not go to prison, for the theft was too old and too tangled in a dead man's absence to prosecute cleanly. But he left Amber Creek within the year, selling the bank at a loss, and moving on to some other town, where the Kane name had not yet been tarnished, a quiet exile that felt, to those who had known Eli Bannerman's story, like a fitting and sufficient justice. Clara used the gold from the strongbox not for herself, though she could have claimed every coin of it as rightfully hers by discovery, but exactly as Eli Bannerman had intended it 15 years before, combining it with the deed to the small parcel of land to establish, with the blessing of the rail company, and the enthusiastic support of the town council that had once doubted her, a modest schoolhouse, and a relief fund for injured rail workers and their widows, the very promise Bannerman had died trying to keep, and that Amber Creek had gone 15 years without knowing it was owed. She named the school for him, the Bannerman Schoolhouse, and arranged, with Amos Whitcomb's help, for a small brass plaque to be mounted at its entrance, recounting, briefly and without bitterness, the true story of the paymaster, who had given everything to protect wages that were never his to keep. She kept the railroad car, repairing it further, as the money allowed, and it stood for years afterward, beside the schoolhouse, no longer an eyesore on a forgotten siding, but something closer to a monument, a physical reminder that value does not vanish simply because the world stops looking for it. Mrs. Pruitt lived to see the schoolhouse's doors open, and often told anyone who would listen that she had always known there was more in that girl than a steady hand with a needle, though even she admitted she had never guessed quite how much more. She had been 17 and utterly without a home when she counted out $3 for a ruined railroad car nobody else wanted, and there were those in Amber Creek who had called it the last foolish act of a desperate girl. But Clara Whitfield had learned, first at her father's forge, and then at Mrs. Pruitt's sewing table, that nothing discarded is quite as worthless as it appears, that the damage in a thing is often only waiting for someone patient enough to find the design hidden beneath it. She had not gone looking for a lost fortune or a dead man's vindication when she pried open that seat cushion by lantern light. She had been looking only for a way to keep warm through a hard winter, and had found instead a 15-year-old wrong waiting quietly to be righted. What she restored in the end was never really about the gold, or even about her own survival, though both mattered a great deal to a girl with nothing. It was about a paymaster's name, erased and forgotten, and spoken aloud again in a schoolhouse that bore it. It was about widows and injured laborers finally receiving what had been promised them a generation late. It was about a town remembering that the quietest, most overlooked things, an old ledger, a rusting rail car, an orphaned girl with a tin box of coins, sometimes carry within them everything needed to make a broken thing whole again. Thank you for spending this time with Clara Whitfield's story, and with all of us here. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that hidden worth is still worth, even when the world has stopped looking for it. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? A person, a place, or perhaps something as small and forgotten as an old railroad car on a rusted siding. We read every story you share with us, and we're always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.